Jonah. This podcast is a Bible study. It requires no knowledge of Accordance Bible software, or Hebrew, or Greek. The story of the prophet Jonah is a delight, filled with unexpected twists and turns. In this podcast, we're going to take a fresh look at the story. In particular, we'll explore the way it turns the tables on its readers. Expecting judgment to fall upon others, we instead find judgment falling upon ourselves. We all have expectations about how life is expected to go. That extends to the books we read or the movies we watch. Romances end with a happy couple reunited after many conflicts. Sci-fi books conclude with the monsters vanquished or the problem solved by a new scientific discovery. In classic westerns, the cowboys always win against the cattle rustlers, the outlaws, and unscrupulous bankers. We're comfortable with these kinds of stories. Predictable characters, plots, and endings. The sense that life is ordered and predictable, and that everything will turn out well. They give us a feeling of safety and security. Unexpected changes in the plot lines catch us by surprise and leave us feeling uncomfortable. So what about the prophets? How do we expect their stories to end? More importantly, what did the ancient Israelites expect of their stories? I'd like to suggest something like the following as a standard prophetic plotline. God calls a prophet, the prophet accepts. God threatens a foreign nation, the prophet delivers God's message. The foreign nation ignores it. God punishes the nation, and the people of God rejoice. If these 7 points reflect the standard plotline, how does the story of Jonah compare? Well, it looks something like this. God calls Jonah. But Jonah runs away. God threatens a foreign nation, so Jonah delivers God's message. But Nineveh listens and repents. God forgives and postpones judgment. And finally, Jonah sulks. Here are the differences between these two outlines, the places where an ancient audience's expectations would have been different. Jonah runs away. Nineveh listens and repents. God forgives and postpones judgment. And Jonah sulks. I've used different colors to indicate my assessment of the amount of tension an ancient audience might experience at these differences. I'm guessing that numbers 5 and 6 probably had them standing up and shaking their fists. We are left with Jonah at number 7 trying to figure out what went wrong. This story is just downright disturbing. So then, the story of Jonah is anything but predictable. It is possible, though, that its very familiarity has blinded us to its exceptional character. Let's try to read it today as if it were the first time, approaching it with what Paul Ricoeur once called a second naivete. Those of you with a bit more of a scholarly bent have probably already guessed at this episode's Bible study methods. Following Herman Gunkel, we're going to do a bit of form criticism and throw in a dash of reader response theory. I'm arguing that Jonah is a broken form. Broken in a very specific way. It traps its readers, or its hearers, and forces them to judge themselves. In that sense, it's very much the same as Jesus' parables. If you'd like to know more about these methods, Accordance has a wealth of resources. Use research, and find the phrases form criticism and reader responds in your tools. Unfortunately, this podcast isn't long enough to read the entire story of Jonah. I do invite you to do so, though, again, approaching it as if it were the very first time. Here, we'll focus on the passages that are most at odds with the traditional prophetic story. That leaves us with these 4 sections. Now, if we look closely at the verse references, we'll see it as these differences that form the bulk of the story, especially the parts about Jonah running away and him sulking. In fact, this story is really about Jonah's struggle, not the citizens of Nineveh. Jonah runs away. Here's what the text said. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Now that part of the book is normal. We expect, at least if we've never read the book before, Jonah to behave like a good prophet and obey the Lord. What comes next is a complete surprise. Jonah heads in the opposite direction. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, we aren't sure where Tarshish is, other than somewhere on the Mediterranean coast. The EDB says it's located far away from Phoenicia and the land of Israel. In other words, Jonah immediately heads in the opposite direction, and we're left scratching our heads trying to figure out why. It's worth mentioning here that the Israelites of Jonah's day believed that Yahweh's territory was the land of Israel, not the other nations. Israel was his home turf and where he was strongest. By leaving Israel and doing so by sea, Jonah hopes to escape Yahweh's influence entirely. Alas for Jonah, as unfolding events will prove, Yahweh's reach is far greater than he's ever imagined. The easiest way to find photos and illustrations for teaching is to use research and select Image and Tools. Now, the folder Graphics Tools will capture most of the images, but I found there's always a tool or two that isn't in the Graphics Tool folder that may still have some good images. In this case, we're searching for images on Jonah, and later, sackcloth. The latest rev of accordance allows us to use the picture viewer to flip through just the images located in the search. When we find ones we like, clicking this arrow will place it in its own tab. We can then arrange the tabs in the order in which we'll use them. In this case, we'll use these pictures to liven up the presentation of the rest of Jonah's story in this podcast. The rest of chapter 1 and all of chapter 2 deal with Jonah's failed escape and his unwilling return. His ship is struck by a great storm. The sailors bail in vain and toss cargo overboard. They can't figure out why the unseasonable storm has come upon them. Casting lots, they select Jonah as the culprit. He admits his fault. Then, rather than suggesting they return him to shore, he tells them to throw him overboard. Apparently, he'd rather commit suicide by sailor than obey God's call. The sailors still try to row back to shore, but failing, they eventually toss Jonah overboard. Jonah doesn't drown, however. Yahweh won't let him. After all, he has a message to deliver. So God sends a great fish to swallow Jonah. 3 days in its belly convinces Jonah to obey God. The fish spits him out on shore, and the story picks up where it left off, with Jonah's call. Nineveh listens and repents. Now something totally unexpected happens in the story. The Ninevites believe God. Wait a minute. What? That's not how the plot is supposed to unfold. These are Israel's enemies. Nevertheless, the passage says a fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Why, the king even repented. One can just see some patriotic Israelite of the day listening to the story, rising and shaking his fist and shouting, "No!" And yet the story is about to get worse for the Israelites. God forgives, postpones judgment. Here's how Jonah 3:10 describes it. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. Okay, now this is just unconscionable. God is supposed to be on the side of Israel, not Israel's enemies. After all, the thought of that day was that Yahweh was Israel's national God. They hadn't yet grappled with the notion that the Creator of the earth might care for everyone, whatever their nation or ethnicity. In fact, if we frame the issue in religious studies terms, the book of Jonah is promoting Yahwism as a universal religion, not a national one. In a universal religion, anyone who repented and believed could serve him, even if they were not Israelite. This concept had to have been disconcerting to many of the Israelites of that day. And, as we will see, it upset Jonah too. Jonah sulks. The entire last chapter of the book centers around Jonah. For the first time, we're told why he fled when God called him to be a prophet. Isn't this just what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I know that you're a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than live. Now, finally, belatedly, we understand Jonah's actions and his fears. The crux of the book is here in 4:4. Does Jonah, or do we, have the right to be angry when God forgives our enemies, when he spares them from destruction? The remainder of this story is an object lesson from nature. Jonah builds a small hut to the east of the city and sits and waits to see what God will do. This picture, from a 3rd century Roman sarcophagus, shows the vine that grows over his head and provides some shade from the hot sun. When it suddenly dies and Jonah becomes angry, God chastises him. You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight, and should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? I trust you've enjoyed this retelling of the story of Jonah. It's been enhanced with pictures from Accordance Resources, historical background on Israel and Nineveh, the use of form criticism and reader response theory, and some insights from religious studies as a discipline. Now, what other Bible stories can you think of that would benefit from the same sort of study? This has been Dr. J for Accordance Bible Software. Thank you for watching this episode of Lighting the Lamp.